Hello everybody, welcome back to the AdvancedVape channel. Today we're going to be doing episode 3 of building a DNA250 color. So just starting out, I kind of want to call myself out a little bit. I'm really not happy with the way that some of the solder joints turned out on this. I know that I'm capable of doing better, but for whatever reason, you know, doing it in a new setup or just it's been a while since I've done one or whatever it is, these are not my best joints. The solder joints on some of the connections, I did my best to clean them up off camera, but they're really not where I'd like them to be. So if this is your first time building one of these, or even if it's your 5th time, you know, something like this could happen, and just roll with it. You know, it still works, and you know, it's not where I would like it to be, but there's not any serious issues with it. So you know, I did my best to clean it up, but it's just something that can happen, and I just kind of wanted to call myself out for that and point out that I know I'm capable of doing better, but it is what it is. Okay, so when we stopped in the last video, I had yet to do the positive and negative 510 wires. I went ahead and did that off camera. That's what these are right here, and these are the two joints that I'm really not that happy with. They're functional, but they could be much better. Anyway, this little clip here is what attaches to the negative portion of the 510. It sits outside it like that and is held on by a nut, which is also what keeps the 510 in place. I wanted to point out really quick that I did not put the wire through the hole there. I just have it laying up against it. And I also want to point out that it's important to get the angle right on this. If you notice that the wire, or the chip is going to be positioned like this, and this clip is pointing to this corner down here. You want to try and get it so that the angle is correct laying in there. Trying my best to show that on camera, but yeah, I have the angle right there so that it's not putting tension on anything. I've also paid attention to how long these wires are. So if I just kind of set this in here real quick, and I'll throw this button back in here. Move this out of the way. This is set up to go over that button and sit right there. And the positive 510 is set up to go underneath the button and to lay right up against that pin with a little bit of room to travel. You want to have a little bit of slack, but not too much. So right about here is perfect. It needs to be able to travel up and down, obviously, with the spring on the 510. So I cut these very carefully as far as paying attention to the length of it. When I originally soldered this on, the wires were probably this long to give me plenty of room. So just something to point out and to pay attention to. I know I did the soldering joints off camera, but these are important to notice. Another thing I want to talk about really quick, the only soldering that we have left on this board is attaching this to the 510, which will happen at the end. I want to talk one more little thing about soldering though. The tip of my soldering iron was right on the borderline of needing to be cleaned in the previous videos, so I thought I would go on and talk about cleaning it. Because that's something that most people don't pay a whole lot of attention to, but it's super important. It's also really easy to do, but you want to make sure that you always have the tip as clean as possible and well tinned, so that it transfers heat easily, especially if you're using non-lead solder. The amount of time that you hold the soldering iron to these pads is very important. You really don't want to have to lay the soldering iron up against it for seconds and seconds. You want it to heat up quickly and be able to get off the pad before too much heat has been passed through the board. So the cleaner the tip is, the easier that is to do. And you know, maybe that was part of my problem, was that it was right on the border of needing to be cleaned and all of that. So I already cleaned this, but I'm going to go through the process again. Here's the tip, and it could be re-tinned. So what I'm going to do is use this. They sell this at Home Depot, or I would assume any hardware store. lead-free solder paste, and this has acid in it. I don't know what type, but yeah, you don't want to touch this stuff or anything like that. But I'm going to get the soldering iron nice and hot. This has been on for a while, and I'm going to use this and some steel wool and my solder. So I start, and you can see where I've already kind of used this, but start by just dipping it in there. And then put some solder on there. And then with the steel wool, just kind of scrape at it. And continue to repeat that process. So you end up with a nice, clean, shiny tip. And you can continue that process for a while if you want, if it's really dirty. But whenever you're done using the soldering iron, it's good to do this just to make sure that it's clean and well tinned on the end there. So I don't know if that is the absolute perfect way to clean these, but that's the way that I do it, and it's important to keep it clean. Okay, so we're going to set the soldering iron aside for a little while. Thankfully, I'm getting a little bit tired of soldering on this project because of the trouble that I had with it. And we're going to go on to something a little bit more fiddly in a different kind of way. So we're going to attach this board to here by these screws, as well as some super glue with the screen. So this little container area for the screen, these 3D printed sleds are not always exact, so sometimes it fits really well and sometimes it's kind of loose. Either way, I like to glue it on there. I've tried a lot of different types of glue in building mods. I've tried different kinds of super glue. I've tried epoxy, and I've tried some weaker glues that are a little bit more rubbery. I've tried hot glue. All of them have their issues, and to me, super glue is the easiest. It's very strong, but it's also possible to break the bonds if you need to, except for the screen. If you super glue the screen down, you're going to end up having to break it to get it off of there. That's just kind of the price that you have to pay for using super glue on there. But as far as super gluing the board into the box, you can definitely get this off of there without breaking this. If you use epoxy or something, you have to break everything to get it off of there. Epoxy is much more powerful, and you're going to make a mess of things trying to take that out. All of the weaker glues, they're too weak and they end up becoming separated. Something like hot glue, the first time the mod gets hot, it's going to separate, and it's terrible. The more rubbery ones, they just don't stick hard enough for me. So super glue is the way to go. And I use this kind, the gel kind. It's not runny, and it'll stay where I want to put it. You really don't want glue running around all over the place while you're trying to do this, and it'll end up sticking to a button or something and turning into a nightmare. If you glue one of the buttons, you're kind of in trouble. So the first step of this was going to be putting the screen on and just kind of rough sitting this on here and not gluing the screen down yet. So being very careful with this. Get this in all the way. Okay, so they're kind of seated together now, but it's not particularly held on very much, so I need to put these screws in there. I'm probably going to start with one of the top ones because it's the easiest. These are little tiny screws, so take your time with it, and you're basically getting it to drill into the plastic. So don't be too rough, but just do it enough so that it's going to hold the board onto the sled and that it has a secure enough connection. Be very careful with the screen while you're wrestling with this. I'm putting a little bit of pressure up against my finger here to start it off because you're drilling into that plastic. You want to try and not keep rotating it indefinitely, but it's not always going to kind of come to a stopping place. You just kind of feel when it's pushed up as far as it can go. So this one is still pretty loose, but if I keep tightening it, it's going to just rip up the plastic in there and not be holding anything. So I'm going to stop messing with it while it's still got a connection on there. This one is going to be a little bit difficult because of that wire. Like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of right on the edge of being in the way, but I should be able to get it in there. Okay, so I've got them all in there. It was a little bit hard with that there, but I got it set up. So at this point, I'm going to extremely carefully put this onto here. These screens are very fragile, so be very careful when you're pushing this onto here. It's very easy to crack these screens. If you feel any kind of resistance, just stop. You have to kind of bend this ribbon down a little bit. Just be extremely careful. To me, it helps to do the upper part first. So push it up in there and then kind of slide it down. Okay, so that's in there now. But it's not really held on that tight. I could probably get by with not gluing this, but I'm going to do just a little drop of glue right in the middle there. And one thing I want to point out, before you glue anything at this point, plug it all in and test it one more time. You want to make sure that screen is working before you glue it down. So I'm going to plug everything and test it real quick. Okay, everything's working. Test the button one more time. Okay, button's working. Can unplug everything and go on and glue the screen down very carefully. Hold it for about 30 seconds. Okay, so that should be glued on there. And when I was holding it down, I was not putting a bunch of pressure, so there's still a little bit of movement there. But if you put a bunch of pressure on this wide screen, you're going to crack it. So now at this point, we're going to glue this onto the board. Or sorry, glue the board onto the enclosure. We're going to be gluing it in there like that with the buttons in place, and obviously the screen protector removed off of here. So the important points when you're doing this are, first of all, because you're kind of freehanding this, there's no kind of guide on where that goes. You need to have this plugged in and on so that you can see what the screen looks like and make sure that it's lined up with this hole. You don't want to kind of put it in there crooked and have part of the screen cut off. Next, you want to make sure, obviously, that you put your buttons in there. And finally, you want to pay attention to where you're putting the glue onto the 3D board. So you don't want to put it anywhere that it's going to run into the buttons or the screen. This button, not a big deal because we're not using it, but what I typically do is put glue all the way along here, all the way along here, a tiny little bit along each of these sides, being very careful, just a tiny bit, and then a drop here and here. But mainly on the areas where you know that nothing is nearby that's going to touch it, because when you press it up against there, it's going to obviously spread out. So just pay attention to the amount of glue and where you're putting it so that it doesn't run. And that's another reason why the gel glue is helpful for me. So I'm going to get this plugged in and then put these buttons in place, and you kind of have to do it upside down to hold the buttons in place. One more thing I'll point out, you want to make sure that there's not any pieces of metal inside here, so give it a good clean. There's just a little bit of dust in here right now from when I cleaned it earlier with the paper towel. But you want to make sure there's no bits of metal, obviously, because if there's metal bouncing around in there, it's going to eventually touch the chip. Okay, so I've got my 3 buttons in there right now, and I'll go on and set this down and get this ready to go. I'm going to go on and plug this in. Take the screen protector off. And now I'm going to have to kind of work quickly and put the glue on. Once I start putting the glue on is when I have to kind of work quickly. This is going to be a little bit hard to show on camera because I have to do it upside down, but I'm trying to work quickly. Alright, so I've got it put on there, and some super glue got kind of around the case. I don't know what it is, just my luck, I guess, or something to do with me, but anytime I'm around super glue, I could be within 100 feet of it, and all of a sudden it is all over my fingers and everywhere. So I end up making a little bit of a mess when I do anything with super glue. So I got a little bit on some different parts of the case, and like right there or whatever, and inside there during the process of gluing this on there. So all you need to do is get some acetone, the more pure the better, and like a Q-tip or something, and wipe it on there, and that will kind of soften up the super glue. So I'm gonna have to do that at a later time. I got most of it off of there, but there's still some fine cleaning that I'm going to do once I finish up. I still have a little bit more super gluing to do, and knowing my luck, it's going to end up all over it again, so I'm not going to bother cleaning it until I'm done with the super glue. So this is glued in and ready to go at this point. I plugged everything in one more time and double checked that it's still working, and it is. The screen is lined up. So from this point, the button is ready to go on, and the 510 is ready to go on. So as far as room and everything, it's going to be a lot easier to put the 510 on right now. And here that is. We have to do a little bit of prep work to get this ready. I'm going to put an atomizer on there just to push it out a little bit. And if you can see, there's a little screw in there. And you can rotate this and change the depth of that screw. So what you want to do is rotate it until the screw is flush with the base. What you're doing here is changing the tension on the screw inside, changing the tension on the spring inside there to make sure that it is at the right tension. If you get that wrong, the spring will be too loose or too tight. So what the manufacturer recommends is that you make the screw flush on there. And once you put solder on here, it's going to lock on there so that you can't rotate it anymore. The solder is going to get down in that thread. And it's done at that point. You can't undo that. So I'm going to go on and plug in my soldering iron and let it heat up while I take a look and make sure that this is set up and ready to have a little pad of solder be put on there to get it ready to put on. Okay, so I'm also going to be using a more powerful flux on this part. You could use this more powerful flux throughout the whole thing. The other one's a little bit easier to clean up, but I'm going to use this kind of flux on the 510. and try and just put an entire drop all the way across the top there. Okay, so we're left with a pretty big drop across the top there. And now I'm going to clean my iron again. From this point, we're going to be attaching it while it's in here. So get the negative out of the way. Put this in there. And one thing you want to definitely make sure that you do I'm probably going to actually tin this first really quick, but after I do that, you want to make sure you put this retaining lug on the positive line. You really don't want to solder this on there and then realize that you forgot to put that on there. So let me tin this real quick and then we'll be ready to attach it. And I also want to point out I've kind of flattened this wire, flattened it out just a little bit so that it spreads across that entire pad. Okay, I've got it tinned. I've got the retaining nut thing on there. I'm going to move this out of the way. And hold this in place while I kind of set it on there. And get this in position to be on that side like this. So this is kind of hard to hold this in place while you're soldering it. I can't obviously hold it with my fingers because I'll burn myself. But I'll probably use a pair of pliers or something to hold it in place there. And then drop another big drop of solder on top of there just to seal them both together. And also, obviously, although we move this out of the way, this is going to have to be in place before the actual last solder. So up there and in the corner before the final soldering. So something like this, with the button going in between the two, is what I was envisioning. Alright, so I'm going to have to solder this off screen to hold this in place, but I will be right back. Okay, so we're back with it kind of soldered in place there. What I ended up doing was using this thing again and pushing it through this hole and just kind of holding that 510 wire in place so I can solder it on there. So the next thing you want to immediately do is put this retaining nut thing on there just a little bit to hold it in place. Okay. Take off this placeholder. Make sure that while you're taking it off that there's free travel there, that it can move back and forth. It's not being held at a weird angle. So this seat's all the way back up in there when I took that off. Now I'm going to take off a functional atomizer off of my other mod. Plug everything in and see if it's reading the resistance and if it's working correctly. Okay, so it's reading pretty close to what the resistance is reading on something else, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but if it's in the ballpark, then you're good. It's probably not going to be exact because we don't have the internal resistance on this setup yet, but it's reading in the ballpark. And we'll see if it'll fire. Obviously, I have to be careful doing this, but okay, so it fires, it works. We can unplug everything and finish up with the button. So obviously a big sigh of relief once everything is on there and it works. One thing I want to say quickly about this nut here. This is like made out of brass or something, so it's kind of soft, but you want to get this just ridiculously tight as you can possibly get it to turn, and a lot of times that ends up with me kind of messing up the surface of this nut. It ends up looking terrible, but you really have to get that tight on there, because sooner or later you're going to have an atomizer on there that you thread on a little bit too tight or something, and if you don't have that nut just crazy tightened down, then the 510 will start to spin, and you'll end up having to open it up and mess around with it to be able to get the atomizer off. So to make this stable, you've really got to tighten that down. I guess maybe you could glue this down on the bottom here, but I would never do that. I want to be able to change the 510, and I don't want glue like right up next to where I'm vaping. So to me, I just rely on this being tightened down. I know that some different 510s have different designs as far as how they handle that, or they make it harder to rotate. So with this 510 in particular, though, you basically just have to tighten the hell out of this. So I'm going to get some pliers or something and tighten that down once we're done with everything else. But for now, I'll see if I can get this to run underneath there. Yeah. Okay, so for now I'm going to push these through the button here. Oh, first I need to put this on to be able to tighten the button down. And then I'm going to push these through, and now I have plenty of room to attach this button on. It doesn't really matter which positive or negative you put on here. It's not really positive or negative. Doesn't make a difference. So yeah, just attach the two wires to here, and I'm going to go on and do that. And then we'll be ready to seat this button after we test it. Okay, so we've got them seated on there, and I could probably cut off a lot of this excess, but it's not really in the way. So I'm just going to push it down and out of the way after I put this, thread this button on, then I'll kind of work on it. That's another thing that I'll tighten a little bit with pliers, although it does not have to be as crazy tight as the 510 does. You want to avoid laying it on a chip if you can, especially this one right here. This gets really hot, especially when the mod is charging, so make sure that it's not right on there, but this should be okay. Or I could even... There we go. Kind of out of the way there. That's a lot of slack that, like I said, I could take quite a bit off of there, but it's okay. Alright, so at this point, we're ready to test the battery after we get this tightened on there. I think the last thing that we need to do with the super glue is put these little case batteries on there, and I absolutely hate doing this, but I'm going to share a little trick that I do to make this go a whole lot easier. The number one thing that you really need to pay attention to when you're doing these magnets is that they are opposite of each other. You want the door to obviously stick on when you put it on there and not be pushed away. And if you just do one magnet at a time, it's really easy to forget which way is which and have to mess with it to figure out, to get them to be opposite so that they attract to each other. So the easiest way to deal with that is to just keep them all in a stack like this. For the first four, which will be on this side, just stick them in with, put a drop of glue on the back side. Stick it in like that. all the way across. And then on the other 4, flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. That way you're making sure that they're opposite, and you don't have to mess with them or even touch them, although I end up touching them anyway and getting glue on myself. But ideally, you could go through that whole process by just putting a drop of super glue on the back side, pushing them down hard, and kind of moving off to the side to cut it off like that. Just push it in, and I'm moving it off to the side. And that kind of makes sure that they're sitting flush when they dry, so they're not sticking out, and that'll make the door not sit flush if they're sticking out at all. So yeah, I'm going to go through that process really quick and super glue everything, and that'll probably be the last that we do on this video. So for the final video, I'm trying to decide if I want to split it into 2 or not, but the things that we have left to do are customizing this case, making it personalized for me, and messing around with the software and the final battery fit and all of that. So the software stuff, we need to check the internal resistance, personalize that or whatever, and get that set up as far as eScribe is concerned. Do the tests and everything. Customizing it is going to be a whole different process, and I haven't made up my mind on what I'm going to do with that yet. So yeah, that's all that we have left to do. All the soldering and the building itself is done. The mod is fully functional as of right now, and the rest is just making it more than just a plain box, and making sure on the software side that everything's working. So yeah, I'll go on and stop this video now, and we'll pick up with finishing up and putting the battery in there, and then talking about the other things in the next episode. So I will see you then.